If there's been an oversaturation of any one genre in entertainment in the last decade, it's been the zombie apocalypse. It's hard today to create a new story within its confines without falling on overused cliches and trite plot devices. 2013 is the year Naughty Dog has stepped away from the Uncharted franchise for a moment to bring us the extremely anticipated post-apocalyptic survival action game, The Last of Us. Does it deliver on the hype, and is it the masterpiece that gamers have been waiting for this generation? Not quite. With all the excitement around The Last of Us, it's going to be hard to live up to the expectations, even harder now that it has received an abundance of perfect scores. So we'll get the bad out of the way to cover what is otherwise a great, albeit far from perfect game. Pacing is a problem with the game early on, while its introduction to this doomed world for the first 15 minutes of playing is a fantastic one. The aftermath 20 years after the introduction takes a little bit of time to build momentum. The first couple of hours will introduce the player to bland, mediocre, predictable, and overused story devices that don't halt until you leave the first major location. As you'll be traveling with a group, you'll also bear witness to the immersion-breaking AI abundantly in these sections as well. While you're sneaking around, your group will frequently pass unnoticed in front of oblivious enemy AI, who also can't see their fallen comrades for that matter. There are an abundance of inconsistencies within the gameplay as well. Sometimes human enemies will notice things like your flashlight, while other times they won't. The Clicker is a blind fungal zombie variant that locates prey exclusively through the use of echolocation, which is interpreted in this world as sound, when it would actually be more based off of movement and visibility. Will sometimes not be able to locate you if you move quietly, while other times will immediately be alerted to your presence when you're not making a sound. In addition to that, with only 4 enemy variants, the selection of opponents can feel a bit limited. The game for the most part looks pretty good for a title of this current generation, but does have a few unusual looking textures and effects, as well as a large noticeable texture pop-in for much of the backgrounds. The combat at times can feel clunky as well, with no ability to dodge or parry, and guns usually aren't very necessary on the default difficulty. In fact, the game really doesn't introduce any new mechanics at all. The stealth gameplay is as simple and primitive as it gets, consisting of nothing more than sneaking up behind an enemy and having the ability to throw things as a distraction. There's a lack of puzzles, and enemies don't react realistically when being shot in places such as the chest, which is made more noticeable due to the more realistic visceral combat. All that being said, the game still manages to pull it together and work in the end. As the story unfolds and builds up to its climax, it introduces less stereotypical characters and twists in its 10 to 15 hour narrative that all build up to a surprisingly insightful, shocking, and logical ending. Everything that happens to Joel from the opening act rationalizes his decisions and acts in the finale, creating a powerful story that makes more sense as you think about it, as opposed to recent titles such as BioShock Infinite that have the opposite effect. Joel is accompanied by Ellie across the country, and she brings a different perspective to the story as well, as she was born after the end of civilization and will often reflect on what it must have been like to live in our modern world, one that she'll never know. Her character is handled well and is surprisingly likable. The voice acting and facial animations are convincing and superbly executed, as with the overall polish.
I sort of shot a rifle before, but it was at rats.
Rats?
Keeping with the current trend of survival horror titles, the events of the outbreak are fleshed out with files found along your journey that add significant amount of emotional depth to what was lost in the transition and how people managed to get by for 20 years. Had the introduction been significantly longer, and had the game not been marketed as a post-apocalyptic zombie game, if that fact had not been realized until about 3 hours into the game, the story would have been even better. While the combat can feel clunky, sometimes it all clicks. Few games can give such a rewarding feel with a highly graphic mixture of gunplay and hand-to-hand combat. As you explore the world, you'll want to stop and take in the sights from time to time as the story moves you across the country. The art direction is solid, and weather effects such as blinding snow are handled masterfully. The gameplay is a loose survival horror action blend that limits your resources and healing supplies for a more grounded approach. The world is full of supplies that can be crafted into weapons such as Molotov cocktails, healing supplies, or used to upgrade your weapons at workbenches. Overall, your journey will be a linear one, with a few more interesting areas opening up slightly for exploration. Some segments will leave you with little else than a flashlight and quiet footsteps as you navigate a shroud of darkness lurking with the infected, while others will place you in brutal shootouts against human opponents with a few memorable encounters between the two. The game has great pacing between fighting these two factions and exploring, but could have benefited from a heavier emphasis on horror and the infected. While the music is subtle and sparsely used, the sound design is fantastic. From the impactful sound of your firearms to the shrieks of the infected denizens, they are among the best. The Last of Us also includes a solid multiplayer component that's similar to that seen in Gears of War, but better. You'll be able to down opponents with only a few bullets, scavenge the maps for supplies similarly to the single-player campaign, and unlock customization options and loadout upgrades that act similarly to the Call of Duty Black Ops Pick-10 system, via the faction metagame that is more or less a semi-skill-based leveling structure. Both of the included game types feature 4-on-4 versus action, with the only difference being one has respawns while the other doesn't. It would have been nice to have a mode including the infected. Despite its inherent flaws, The Last of Us offers a great story with great characters, some of the best looking graphics of this console generation, excellent sound design, memorable locations and enemies, and a fun, unique multiplayer component. In a year that already has a few great games with more ahead, The Last of Us will stand out among the crop, but it probably won't be remembered as the best.